It's official. Well, it's good to have everybody here tonight, and as we continue in our study on evidences, tonight is the one that I look forward to the most, but the problem is, this morning I realized I had about 3 hours worth of class, so I thought I gotta cut it down, and even as I got here tonight, I was still cutting it down a lot, and so that unfortunately means that I'll probably even still be a little rushed trying to get through everything that I want to talk about tonight. Because as we're talking about our idea of evidences for the Bible, the one we're going to be talking about tonight is the historic evidences of the Bible. Like I said, that's just kind of the one that I like the best. Next week, Anthony is going to be doing. Anthony, which one are you doing next week? Do you remember? You're still doing historic, yeah. Which is unfortunate because I wanted that one again. But Anthony will be covering that one next week for us, so I appreciate that. And as we've talked about this, we've said that when we think about the idea of evidences for the things that are in the Bible, we're not saying that these are the things that we need in order to believe the Bible, because we believe we have faith. And evidences don't create faith. There isn't a concept that evidences can create faith, but we do like to understand ways that evidences can reveal to us things to understand about the nature of God. Romans chapter 1, Paul said, we're going to talk about this one Sunday morning. Romans chapter 1, Paul said that in nature, all around us are things that we can look at that give us a reason to understand that there is a God. And whenever we want to consider the idea of how the Bible reveals itself to us, we want to understand that the Bible, as a very credible textbook, history book, whatever we want to consider it, has evidences for us to consider as well. Before we get started, let's take a second. Let's go to our Father in a word of prayer. Would you pray with me? Holy Father in heaven, we come to you in prayer, and we give thanks, Father, that we have a few minutes of time in the middle of our week, that we can come together, Father, and we're blessed, and you've watched over us to allow us to do this. And Father, that we might break the bread of life to consider your word and consider the things that are evidenced in the world around us to the truth that your word holds for our lives. Father, we have come to believe that you are our God, and we believe that this is your word. And yet, Father, we seek to equip ourselves so that we might be able to explain to those who might not believe the great many things that testify to the veracity of your will. Father, continue to watch over us in this week, and in the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. So let's talk a little bit about the idea of history itself. Might have thought some of the questions that you had in your handout were kind of unusual to think about. For example, one of the questions I asked you was this: why is it that you obey U.S. law and not, say, Canadian law? You think this is an easy question, right? Why isn't it? What would you say? George, you got an answer?
As a citizen of this country, we're under their authority.
George says he's a citizen of this country and under that authority. George, why are you a citizen of this country? And George being born here is called ancient history. It's history. Why do you obey American law? You were born here, you came here, whatever it is, you brought yourself here. It's a story, it's history. History is why you obey the laws of this land. It's what we might say makes you an American, or if you are American, it's what makes you who you are. This is what's so important to understand about history, because history is a way of establishing authority. You ever see a law office and you see all the books they have on the wall that all look the same? Those are cases, case law. Cases are just stories. They're just things that happened. They're actually kind of interesting to read sometimes. Something happened to somebody got sued, tells a little story about what might have happened. And like I said, it's a story. It's history. Authority is history. So when we talk about ideas like the importance of having authority, oftentimes what we're saying is that, well, for example, if we say we're the New Testament church, what are we appealing to? History. But which history? The New Testament is history. Lots of churches don't appeal to that, right? They might say, well, we were founded by X person. Do you see how history is different there? And so the appeal of the authority of history is made different there. So the idea is the distinctions, the differences are differences about history. History establishes authority. History establishes identity. History establishes identity as well. And one of the things we have to understand if we're considering these things is the concepts of perspective in history. I asked you another odd question. I said, how would the history of the American Revolution be different if you were reading it in a British history book? What do you think?
The Americans were the traitors.
Yeah, those traitorous Americans. Gregor, what do you got?
I was going to say that they're obviously a violent bunch. I mean, they didn't think a lot of us at the time.
Yeah. That Gregor said they didn't think much of us at that time. Teresa throws out here in our chat, those rebels. Who are the good guys?
Well, the king.
Yeah, the king is the good guy. And the bad guy? Well, we would call him the father of our nation, right? George Washington. He's the bad guy in that story. Grant throws out the thing. He says they probably wouldn't think it was very important. It's the founding of our country. It wasn't even a speed bump in theirs. And so it really wouldn't be that important. So you might get a sense to say, well, sometimes the way that history comes across is about the perspective of the person that's giving it to us. Now, that's important to understand because that's why the Bible, giving us history, as using it like a history book, has a perspective. What is the perspective of the Bible as far as history goes? What is it trying to tell us? And I realize that's a big question. Bring it down just as narrow as you can.
The Old Testament represents the genealogy of God. His chosen race, his chosen people, all the way through David's seed.
Excuse me.
It establishes a lineage.
So Gregor said the idea of a genealogy, of a lineage. He says the Old Testament tells the story of the people of God. I like that maybe the best. It tells the story of the people of God. So what's interesting is while it might give us some stories about some of the big things that happened in the world, in the end, they're only there to qualify the perspective it wants us to understand, the story of, and what's it really begin with? Well, it begins with creation, but what's the thematic story kind of move with? Pretty early on, we're trying to meet a guy named Abraham. And even though you're right, he talks about the creation, the flood, those things, they're just trying to get us to Abraham, which in a lot of ways is really the beginning of the story. So it's not meant to tell us perhaps some of the things that about ancient history that we want to understand. And that's why sometimes when we look at how the Bible records history, we might kind of be puzzled. Somebody always says, well, why does it talk about these people and not other people or things like that? Because the Bible's only interested in telling us a story, not the history of the human race, but the history of a group of people that were God's chosen people in the Old Testament. And what happened to them, the lessons for them, and we might consider 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 11, which says these things were written for our understanding, upon whom the end of the ages have come, that we might have a hope. He talks about in Romans chapter 15 and verse 4. But the point was that it wasn't meant to be a story of these people. And yet, these nations all around that were the great empires of ancient history, and they're names that most of us are familiar with from the Bible. I don't know if you were a big student in ancient history, you'd remember these names as well. The Assyrians, the Egyptians, Babylonians, Persians. One of the things we want to understand is that their interaction with the Bible is going to sound a lot different. Their interaction with people in the Bible is going to sound a lot different. And we say all this just to say that perspective helps us a lot to understand things in the Bible. And so sometimes we'll see something and we'll say, well, that's not quite how it happened. But remember, it's not the biblical perspective oftentimes that these ancient histories tell us. Teresa makes the comment, she says that the Bible could be described as the history of man and his relationship with God. Really, that does fit nicely, especially if we were to take the whole Bible in that kind of statement. Lisa Root says it teaches us to learn from history. And again, that's one of the important ideas the Bible wants us to understand, that we're supposed to look at these things and learn lessons from them. So I've got another question for you. When you think back to the Old Testament, what parts of the Old Testament are going to be things that would have a history of everybody, of the whole world? What parts of the Bible would you say have a history of the whole world? What do you think? What parts in the Old Testament have a history of the whole world?
The flood.
The flood is one. That's, in fact, that's an important one. We're going to come back to that. Where's that? Where do you find that? I'll put you on the spot. Back in Genesis, right? So we might say, well, Genesis. But what parts of Genesis?
The dry and the wet part.
What's that?
The dry and the wet.
Dry and the wet part before and after the flood. It's not a bad point, actually. Because really it's about chapter 10 and 11 where we meet the guy that the big story is about, Abraham. And we kind of leave world history behind. So really, we only have about 10 chapters in the book of Genesis that are all about ancient history. And what are the things that are common to all people? Well, Lindsay already said one, the flood. What other things, by the way? You think of anything else? The Tower of Babel. Good. Things common to the whole human race. So let's kind of dwell on this. Oh, Anthony, go ahead. Oh yeah, marriage. And by the way, what does the Hebrew writer say about marriage among everybody? Yeah, it's honorable among all. Yeah, so marriage is something universal. Interestingly enough, it's also something that came about Genesis chapter 2. So why am I saying all this? Well, the point is, if the Bible is accurate, then the things we find in those first 10 chapters are things common to all human history. And they should be things that aren't exclusive to the story of God's people. So things like the flood or the Tower of Babel should be things that are universally found in all cultures, if the Bible is accurate. Now, what do you think we're going to find?
Yeah.
Absolutely they are. The flood. I had a bunch of stuff on the Tower of Babel and I took it out. It's a fascinating thing to consider all the pyramid builders and mound builders and ziggurat builders of the ancient world, and how you're going to kind of get a sense here in a moment of what they all seem to have in common. But let's talk about the flood for just a couple of moments. We read about the flood beginning in Genesis chapter 6, and we talk about how the specifics of the flood. Will you tell me, what are some of the specific things about the flood story, the account found in the Bible? Lisa adds, by the way, Lisa Root says creation is also something that's one that's found throughout other societies. That's a very interesting one too. Again, I had to take it out for the sake of time. What are some of the specifics?
Small groups saved.
Small group saved. Yeah, Bible says 8 people are saved. What else? Oh, and Teresa had it too. Only 8 people entered the ark and saved. What other things are kind of specific to that story?
There was an ark.
There was an ark. What was on the ark, Ryan? God was displeased with mankind. Very good.
Animals. Lots of animals.
Lots of animals. Very good.
It rained.
It rained. Very good. I'll tell you what, let me kind of go through a list here I've got for you. So one of the, Grant Haynes, Barry and Debbie pointed out the specific dimensions of the ark. That's very specific in the Bible. Grant Haynes pointed out that people were living longer beforehand. Grant, I didn't even have a moment to talk about that, but one of the fascinating stories we're going to understand is that lots of ancient cultures agree that before the flood, people did live much, much longer than they do now. 200 accounts of the flood, 200 plus, it's more like 250. Now, here's what's incredible about this. This is one of those things that sociologists and historians just, if you don't believe in the Bible, you find perplexing. There's 200 plus accounts of a flood that occurred. The ancient Sumerians, Native Americans, South Americans, Inca, Aztec, Mayan, Greeks, Romans, China, all over the world, ancient societies everywhere, they all hold to the story that there was once a flood. And that flood wiped out the world. Now, what's more interesting is this. The question I asked you was to think about the idea is, how is it that there might be ways to ascertain whether or not the Bible was the original? So somebody might say, okay, maybe there was a flood, but maybe the Bible just got that story from someone else. How would you find details, how would you, if you're a detective, figure out a way to say which one was the original story? Somebody said something. The oldest would help. Now that what's interesting is we don't know if the Bible's the oldest one. Interesting enough, because Moses wrote the Bible, or wrote the book of Genesis around 1450, and the account of the flood is older than it, of course. So maybe oldest. What else? That's a good one.
The one that had the most common.
Oh, Wendy, somebody's been talking to you, huh? No. Wendy says the one that has the most commonality, common details. So whenever they analyze the flood, what they find is this: when they go across this thing right out the top, 9 out of 10 start off by saying there is a small group of people. Actually, 1 out of 10 say 8 people. That's 1 out of 10, but I mean like a lot. Say there's 8, but just a small group of people, a small family. 2/3 say we're forewarned ahead of time. 2/3 say because, Ryan said it, the wickedness of mankind. 95% say it was just a flood. They don't have earthquakes or other things that came. It was just a flood. And 95% say it was a global flood. It was all over the whole world. 70% say they survived by an ark, something that they created to do that. Over 2/3 say that animals were brought on board and animals were preserved the same way. 75%, 3/4 of them talk about the animals, again, being brought in the way they were. 2/3 roughly say they landed on a mountain when it ended. 1/3 of them tell the story of the birds being sent out one at a time. Rainbow is mentioned about 10% of the time. 15% of the time, sacrifices were made by those when they came out. Now, here's what's interesting, is that those details are, of course, we're familiar with the account that's in the Bible. And they represent a core group of details that went out into all these other stories that can be traced back, that can't be cross-connected. So one of the great ones is that, like in the Mayan story, I think I've even told you this, in the Mayan account of the flood, they even tell the story that after the flood, the chief of the family built a great vineyard and got drunk. And one sociologist was looking at that, he says, well, clearly that's too close to the Bible. Didn't like that. So one of the fascinating things, and I've often said that the really incredible thing is that while the flood gives us a lot of details, and Stephen Root makes a point here about that. He says details are what make you able to tell these things. That those specific details are what bring us back to say that the Bible account is the original account that all these others came out of. Now, what's so exciting about this is that, like I said, the flood becomes something that for a lot of people they say, well, flood. But this also becomes the most documented event in the ancient world. I mean, when you talk about a comet, you might have 2 or 3 people at the most mentioning it. But when we talk about the flood, to have over 200 accounts of it, it's the most documented event in the far ancient world. And that's remarkable. So the very thing that a lot of people would say, oh, I don't believe the Bible because of something like the flood. Ironically, the flood is one of the best reasons to believe the Bible because it has such a profound testimony about all these things. What happened right after the flood? Now, the Tower of Babel, and I'd love to go into that, but for the sake of time, I didn't. But do you remember a few little details right after the Tower of Babel or at the same time about a guy named Nimrod? What do you know about him? Nimrod. We don't talk about him too much. Sometimes you just call somebody a Nimrod. It's the good reason we picked that name to insult people because he wasn't well regarded. Nimrod. What's the significance of Nimrod in the Bible? Who knows? Nimrod was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That's what the Bible talks about him, but that's not what made him significant. What did he do? Mr. Hetzer's looking. But I'll bet Mr. Hetzer knows. He's like that. He'll look, but he already knows. Mr. Hetzer, tell us, what did Nimrod do? Oh, you don't remember? Okay, good. Let's go play trivia again, but you won't beat me this time. He founded Babylon, Nineveh, and by the way, the ancient name of Nineveh was Nimrod. That's a fascinating thing. Babylon, Nineveh, Assur, which became Assyria. Here's what's fascinating, is that the Babylonians talked about him too. They wrote stories about Nimrod too, founding all those cities. They knew him by a different name. They knew him by the name Sargon. But the point is, they knew this story too. And sometimes we just kind of take it for granted, but the Bible tells us the story of the beginning of civilization. And it points to all the key players in the beginning of civilization. It talks about how the Egyptians were kind of that cradle in the Nile region. We meet them right away in Genesis, right after chapter 12. And we meet Abraham, we meet the Egyptians. Abraham, by the way, is from, don't say Babylon, but that'd be close. Ur of the Chaldeans, which is in the region of Babylon. This is the ancient world. And what's fascinating, and like I said, this might not be something that's too appealing to you, but I just think it's incredible, is that the Bible follows the path of human history from ancient, well, right up until the Roman times. And it never makes a mistake as far as calculating which nation was there. It records the rise of Assyria. It records the fall of Assyria. It records the rise of Babylon, the fall of Babylon. And what's funny is that they're all just in the background. It's not like the Bible said, hey, let's record the rise and fall of these nations. It's all background to the main story. But that background is marvelous because it establishes, again, the veracity that whoever wrote these things was there. Whoever wrote these things was there. By the way, Stan got the point. He said it was Nimrod, the mighty hunter. But what we want to say is he founded the first, according to the Bible, those first ancient cities. And what's fascinating is that, the ancient Babylonians understood that story as well. It's a fascinating thing to consider. But I want to jump ahead to the story of Israel, because that's where I want to kind of sit and do most of our discussion tonight and kind of say, what about Israel in the Bible? We meet the patriarchs in Genesis, and it brings us to Exodus. Really, Genesis just to get us to Exodus, to explain to us how a family ended up in Egypt that then became the nation of Israel. In Exodus, of course, we talked about, that was our last study, the book of Exodus. We talked about the law of Moses and the things like that. And so we begin there to say, what is the importance of the history of these people, and how accurate can we trust these things? And one thing we have to say is that if we're going to say that the totality of the Bible is inspired, it's all those things we talked about a few weeks ago that it claims of itself, then we would have to expect that the accuracy of the Bible is going to be consistent. In other words, if the Bible, some people think the Bible was written, or the Old Testament was written, say, around 200 or 300 BC. A lot of people believe that. If that's the case, then what we should expect is a lot of things, or relics, or artifacts, or things around 200 or 300 BC might testify to the Bible, but we wouldn't expect much beyond that. Now, if the Bible is what it claims, a lengthy history written by people that were there, we should expect a testimony from history that is consistent all through that time. Hope you kind of follow me there. If you're not, it's okay, because you'll just get to see some neat things here in just a moment anyway. So let's ask ourselves, what kinds of ways would history testify? Well, we might say, I talked about the flood and all the different accounts of the flood. I find that fascinating, but let's pick something a little more related to, as I said, to something we can look at. So I picked four ways that the Bible might testify or be testified to by history. Number one, places. The Bible has a lot of places. Now, we're not talking just the idea of the geography of the Bible, which itself is so profoundly important that we're going to do a class just on that. But the idea that there are some things in the Bible described as being some places that are extremely important, we need to say, are they there? Artifacts, number two, artifacts, just things, odds and ends that would testify in an abstract way, in a background way. These things are real. Number three, people. Are there people in the Bible that are also outside of the Bible? And finally, ancient writings. Grant's got a comment here. Grant Haynes says, it's interesting that world history is only the background. Because if the Bible was written by a much later human writer, you would expect it to focus more on the big events the writer knew better. You know, that's true. In fact, a lot of books that are fake books that are supposed to sound religious, they can't help but to look at the big picture of history and try to make that the big theme. One of the fascinating things is that the Bible puts the history of the world in the background to the story it wants to tell. And that's, as I said, that's marvelous. Let's talk about locations. Well, like I said, one of them I mentioned already, and it goes all the way back to the beginning, and that is the city of, what's the city that Abraham's from again? Ur. Ur's a neat place. I've never been, so I can't. I think it's a neat place. In the background there is a ziggurat, and I really wish we could have talked a little more about the Tower of Babel and some of the significance of something like this, but we'll just, like I said, maybe another time. By the way, what was the city that they were building around the Tower of Babel? Do you remember the significance of what they were building that city out of? Clay bricks, mud bricks. Kind of interesting. You know, our most ancient societies, the Harappan culture of the Indus Valley, these ancient Sumerian and Akkadian civilizations in the Mesopotamian area, they all built the same way the Bible describes those first things being built. I've always found that very fascinating. But the fascinating thing is that Ur wasn't really known as a city till it was rediscovered much later. You see, by 500 BC, it was long gone from history. Now that's important because to say that Abraham was from there indicates whoever knew that wrote at a time when, you know, either A, if they were making it up, they would had to write way back there, or B, they had some information that we can't account for. Very interesting as we think about that. This missing city that was only located in the last century or two, that was unknown and yet is known now to be one of the most ancient cities in the world, one of the first places. So right off the top, the Bible gives us a little ding that we can go to. Now, I had to get creative. I had to take out most of my pictures because it's, again, for the sake of time. So I ran along, pulled out a bunch of stuff out of Egypt, threw those away, took, you know, all sorts of the area of Canaan and all that. And I thought, well, let's go to Jericho, because Jericho is an interesting one. Jericho is a city that's referenced many times in the Bible. It's significant throughout the Bible. And you know, we have a great sense of where it was, how it sat in its importance, how it was built and rebuilt time and time again. That's something that archaeologists love to talk about with Jericho, is how many times it was rebuilt. And the Bible tells us it was rebuilt many times as well. Again, whoever tells us these accounts knew exactly what they were talking about. But what do you think probably the most significant city is? Jerusalem. Now this is kind of interesting. What was the original name of Jerusalem? What was its first name? It's had several names, I guess you'd say. But remember what it was called whenever Abraham showed up the first time? What was it called? Abraham shows up, he meets Melchizedek, he is the king of, somebody said it, Salem. Yep, Teresa got it, Salem. You know what's really cool? The oldest reference to the city of Jerusalem is an Egyptian writing about the time of Abraham, and it talks about the city of Salem, not Jerusalem. That's really neat. But that's not even the big thing. So the picture you see here is probably one of the oldest structures in Jerusalem. They figure this is probably David's palace steps. I don't know how they figure that, actually. I should say I didn't do a lot of research into that, but it's pretty commonly accepted that. The thing about Jerusalem as a city is it's a fascinating place. And it's a key part of the story of the Old Testament. It's a figured apart. What's so important about it? Why is Jerusalem such a significant place? What's there that made it important? Yeah, the temple. So, what's fascinating is we have a pretty good image that we can look at, and Debbie and Barry got it too, the temple, that we can look at and we can see, hey, this is the platform, by the way, that big orange thing there, the big orange looking thing, what is that? Yeah, it's a mosque. It's the mosque of, is it the Mosque of the Golden Dome? You know, that would be a cheesy name. I shouldn't say cheesy, but it would be a kind of a giveaway name. I can't remember if that's the name though. But the whole idea is, today it's a mosque. Under that mosque, by the way, it's kind of cool. There's a hole right in the middle. They call it the Well of Souls. Yeah, that was the name in Raiders of the Lost Ark, too. Well of Souls. No archaeologists have ever got to go down there. Why not? Kind of goes to a question we have. Actually, hold the answer to that. We'll come back to that here in just a moment. But here's the temple, and it's a fascinating thing that we can just look at the things around it. We don't think much about it, and yet for lots of people, you know, we've used examples of other religions that have tried to create histories and have nothing to show for it. We know exactly where these things are. Now, Stephen Root got it. Stephen Root says it's the Dome of the Rock. You know, that is what it's called. I couldn't remember. That is what it's called, the Dome of the Rock. Stephen Root gets a brine point for getting that right. So that's an online brine point that's worth twice as much as the originals, so we might say. So the Dome of the Rock is right. But here's what's interesting about that temple. You know, it's all the time they, you know, finding things there, but a lot of those things get destroyed. Anybody know anything about that? Stan Malore, if he were here, he had an interesting story about this to tell us. But does anybody know why do so many artifacts from the temple get destroyed? Well, again, look at the picture. What's on it?
Yeah, many of them are made of gold, or at least, you know, brass, which was also very valuable at the time.
Well, it's interesting that a lot of ancient antiquities get destroyed because, you know, people want out of them, but particularly these do.
I'm just wondering if the Muslims consider the Bibles, and so they destroy them.
Yes. So in other words, right now, if you look on this, as you see, there's a mosque on it, and nobody's allowed to dig around to find anything. And the point is that oftentimes when things do come up, they are destroyed. There's a great example where they were bulldozing what's called Solomon's Stables. These probably weren't Solomon's Stables, but they were an ancient structure nearby, and they went and they bulldozed them because it gives veracity to the Bible. So it's kind of an interesting thing that, you know, a lot of people have actually intentionally destroyed artifacts or relics that might have had some significance to the Bible. So that's kind of an interesting thing to consider. So when we talk about artifacts and things that we're talking about, there's lots of little things. My favorite, though, and for the sake of time, we're only going to talk about one, are seals. Seals they're real small, usually about the size of a dime, maybe a little bigger, and they might have been wax or something like wax. And of course, what it was is that a document was written. You've seen lots of movies and stuff where they dribble the wax and then they stick maybe a ring or back then they were actually round, and you just kind of like a marble, and you'd roll it on it, and it would roll out a little picture, roll out a little image of something like that. And so it's a pretty common thing to find. But what's incredible is that they're finding them all the time. They find them all the time of things, of people in the Bible. So at least one list, you know, there's a lot of different lists, and this is probably one of the more conservative lists. It talks about 20 people who are mentioned in the Bible, people who are part of the Bible story, not just background people, but people that were critical to the story, and some that weren't critical to the story. And that's kind of important, by the way. In fact, you tell me, why is it significant that we find seals of people that maybe are just mentioned as being the father of someone or the son of someone? Why is that actually a pretty good thing when it comes to historical evidence? Why is it hey, we didn't find David, Solomon, we didn't find the top guys, but we found some guy that was his cook. Why is that pretty significant?
You're not going to make up a cook.
Yeah. In other words, it gives a sense that if they were finding all the preeminent people of the scriptures, we'd be pretty sure they weren't legitimate finds. But one of the reasons that they're so certain they're legitimate is oftentimes they're people that have a minimal significance or just, again, a background thing. And that's one of the fascinating things about the Bible, is that historical evidences tend to be background evidences. So somebody here suggested before, maybe one reason is if we were finding David's, a seal, what would happen, Rob? Oh, I thought you were going to make a comment. What would happen if you found, what?
It could be something, and it could turn into something that's venerated.
Yeah, it would probably become something to be worshipped. We talked about how that was the case as well. So all sorts of little artifacts are found all the time. Like I said, scattered across history that give us this really great testimony of the accuracy of these things. Third one, let's talk about people in the Bible. People in the Bible. Well, one thing is the Bible mentions a lot of people in passing that from a world history standpoint are of great significance. There's 5 pharaohs mentioned by name, a lot of pharaohs that aren't mentioned by name, but 5 pharaohs specifically mentioned by name, and we can go to Egypt, we can look at their tombs, we can see their names carved on things. 19 kings of Mesopotamia, that includes Persians and Assyrians and Babylonians. Sometimes they'd talk about people and there'd be a question whether or not that person really lived, and then we find some evidence of them. 23 Israelites are mentioned in other places and other writings from the Old Testament alone. You know, one of the oldest ones, one I didn't know about, was one of the midwives of Israel. It's considered one of the oldest references of a person in the Bible outside of the Bible, and they found her name in a name list of slaves in a very ancient Egyptian document. I thought that was really cool. So there's a lot of writings that have that as well. And I got a comment here. Stan makes a comment. Stan makes the statement. He says, Michmash was the secret pass that helped the British attack the Turks during World War I. He says the British were in a tough spot, and one of the Arabs came and told them there was a mountain pass Jonathan had used to attack the Philistines. You know, that's interesting. I think I had heard that before, Stan, but maybe Stan was the one who had told me that. But the story goes that during World War I, they used Jonathan's secret pass in order to attack their enemies. So that's kind of an interesting thing, Stan. Thanks for that little note there. Ancient writings. Well, one of course, ancient writing is we have some pretty ancient copies of the Old Testament. One of the oldest ones was written on a scroll of, I can't remember if it was bronze or copper, but it was a metal scroll, and it's a portion of the book of Numbers, chapter 6, the priestly blessing. And what they think maybe was this was actually something that somebody had written down and like a phylactery or something like that, where they put it in a box or something like that because of the small size of it. But it's pretty old. It goes way back about 8th century BC, so we have some pretty ancient copies of that. But one of the fascinating things we have a lot of are a lot of writings around the Bible that tell Bible stories. So, for example, there's a stone that was discovered about a century ago, and it tells the story of a king who overthrew the house of David. And he mentions people, and they realize, hey, this is the same stories found in 2 Kings chapter 1 and 3 and 4. In fact, specifically, the king that's told of in 2 Kings chapter 3, King Mesha, who overthrew the Israelites, he wrote his own account of the story, and they dug that up, and they found it. And he tells the same story that's found in 2 Kings from his perspective, of course. But again, it's this testimony that we have. The Assyrians tell the story of how Israelite kings came to them. In fact, this is a picture right here of one of the kings of Israel bowing down. They call him a son of Omri. Omri being one of the last kings, or one of the kings of Israel. And they talk about this king coming and giving homage. And we find that roughly accounted for in 2 Kings chapter 10. One of my favorites is something called Sennacherib's Prism, which tells the story of how the Assyrians besieged Hezekiah. It tells it from their perspective. Doesn't mention the fact that God wiped out their army, but it's kind of interesting that other historians, ancient writers, talked about the Assyrian army being destroyed, but we find the same account in Isaiah 37 or in 2 Kings chapter 19. And so what we see here is that there's a consistency of these things, that we're always finding these statements. Another one I didn't get a picture of is this the Cylinder of Cyrus, which is a restatement of how the Jews were set free. It's the very proclamation that's mentioned at the end of 2 Chronicles, and how it was that they were established and set free, just exactly as the Bible gave it. As I said, these aren't things that we would say, hey, I need to see that in order to believe. But there are things that we say, you know, if this is true, then I would expect to find things throughout history that would testify to that. Random objects, like I said, not specific things perhaps, but just things that would testify to it. And we have an overabundance of those things. We have a tremendous abundance of those things. As I said, with this cylinder, by the way, it's not a very big cylinder. It's it's only about maybe that big. And in the story, as it goes, Sennacherib tells the story of how he locked up Hezekiah in this city of Jerusalem. He surrounded it. And by the way, when the Bible tells the story, the Bible tells us that he fled away and he was later murdered. And again, the Assyrians documented that. These same Assyrians told the story of how they destroyed the cities of Judah and they carved images of it. Again, these images, these panels that they carved and put in their palaces had pictures of Israelites from the time of Hezekiah. Again, these things, this weight of testimony just kept building up again and again. All these different testimonies, all these things that follow through. And now, although the Bible is only telling us these things as a peripheral, as a backstory, the significance is that as they follow through, they give us this point. Got a question for you. Question number 8. If you look at your handouts there, one might say though that sometimes maybe there's not enough evidence. Somebody says to you, "Hey, where is the Ark of the Covenant? Where is the Ark of the Covenant?" You know, the Bible doesn't even tell us exactly what happened to it. There's a lot of guesses about, you know, some of the things that might have happened maybe in Jeremiah's time or before, maybe one of those pharaohs of Egypt, Shishak. Why is it we don't have Aaron's rod or things like that? You know, and it's interesting. It's interesting to think about this. Why aren't these things there? If somebody says, you know, for example, maybe another person says, you know, we don't have enough information to prove this really happened. What does this saying mean? The absence of evidence does not equal the evidence of absence. What does that mean? Gregor?
Just because we don't have physical evidence doesn't mean it didn't happen.
So, for example, I'm trying to think of an example of what we're describing here. If I pulled out of my pocket, George, go ahead. Noah's Ark is another great example of something.
We've already shown testimony of the flood.
Yeah.
Can't find the ark.
Yeah, that's actually a really good one. Really good. So if I reached into my pocket and I pulled out 4 quarters, and the quarters were, you know, 1999, 2005, 2010, 2015, would I be right to say, I guess they didn't make quarters before 1999? Why not? Well, again, this is this concept that the absence of evidence doesn't prove or doesn't testify. So there are things we don't find. George mentioned the Ark of Noah's Ark. That's a better example than, say, the Ark of the Covenant. But there's lots of things that we say, well, we don't find. But the fact that they're not there is important. In fact, the second part of that question was, why might some of these artifacts be missing from time to time? Kind of already mentioned one point. Gregor suggested the idea that they might become venerated. Why else?
God wants us to believe what he says by faith.
Right. What's fascinating about the Bible is that the testimony of the Bible is peripheral. As I said, I keep emphasizing that we have this sense of the evidences are just around the Bible, and yet the most critical things that the Bible expects us that we have to believe, there can't be evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. What we can't find a bond because it can't be. We have to believe that by faith. The miracles Jesus performed to testify to him, we have to believe that by faith. And so the circumstances we would say are that the great importance of these things is that they're not important. And that's what's really remarkable. So from a historical standpoint, the Old Testament, proven completely accurate. There's just no question. Like I said, even the things that some people struggle with, like the longevity of people in ancient times, the account around the flood, those are things that actually from the historical standpoint aren't too difficult to validate. All the little details of things, we can pick up things, and yet the most significant things, the life of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, those are the things that we are left to take by faith. The Bible is demonstrated to have an absolute, a firm accuracy in historical testimony. A lot of times people have tried to discredit it, and they have utterly failed. Got a last comment. Teresa says, she talks about some of the artifacts stolen or destroyed by nations. That's actually a really good point. Stan Malor says, kind of like carbon detecting, the absence of carbon does not prove things one way or another. That's a good point too. So we'll bring ourselves to a close. We're just about at our time, so we'll stop here. Thank you for comments and thoughts. And next week, Anthony's going to move on for us, and he's going to talk about some of the things out of the New Testament. So look forward to that time. So thank you so much.